I want you to close your eyes and picture a jazz band in your head. It doesn't need to be any specific outfit, just a generic group of people playing jazz. What instruments are you picturing? I'd bet that for almost all of you, there's a saxophone in there, probably a trumpet, maybe a bass and drums and a piano. Those are definitely the instruments that tend to come up when you search for jazz images on any stock website. Sure, jazz has grown into a vivid, diverse genre that can be played on pretty much any instrument you can name, but the enduring image of jazz remains tied to a select few instruments. And it makes sense why. These are the tools of the most iconic artists of the genre, those who reshaped it in their own image and found immortality in the process. But have you ever wondered why it is that this set of instruments in particular defined jazz? There's a temptation to offer up an easy, if circular, answer. Those are the jazz instruments. That wasn't always the case, though. Early jazz bands had some similarities to the iconic lineups we think of today, but they were also quite different in many ways. It wasn't uncommon to see tubas and banjos in New Orleans' first jazz orchestras, and when you stop to think about it, it is actually a little odd that this collection of instruments came together to define jazz as we know it today. The trumpet and snare are instruments of war, while the upright bass has a history in string orchestras. It's not that these instrument pairings are absurd or unheard of before jazz, but they aren't quite as natural as we've come to think of them today. And by exploring how this group of instruments came together, we can learn a thing or two about the cultural history of jazz, and about the cultural history of the country that created it. Let's take a closer look. The story of the trumpet pretty much begins at the start of recorded history. The earliest ancestors of the instrument were made from things like animal horns and conch shells, but manufactured trumpets came along pretty fast. We know the ancient Egyptians had metal trumpets thanks to a bronze and silver trumpet found in King Tut's tomb in 1922. But these trumpets weren't exactly suited to play When the Saints Go Marching In, or really much music at all. They likely only played one note and were probably used for ceremonial and military purposes rather than musical. And that holds true for most of the history of the trumpet, really. While there were developments in trumpet technology over the next several millennia, we need to fast forward all the way to the 19th century to get to an instrument that you might be able to play jazz on. Throughout the first half of that century, a number of instrument makers began to develop systems of valves that completely transformed how brass instruments were played. These valves allowed players to modify the length of their instrument's tubing with the press of a button. This meant that for the first time, brass players could easily play every note in a chromatic scale, and it completely transformed how the instruments were used. Up until this point, trumpets had been used as a supporting instrument in orchestral traditions. They were used for dramatic blasts, rhythmic pulses, or simple signals, while strings or woodwind carried the melody. But once brass instruments could reliably carry the melody, they became a favorite of celebrated composers and amateur musicians alike. By the 1850s, a brass band craze was taking America by storm, stirring up no shortage of controversy in the process. In 1853, music journalist John Sullivan Dwight wrote an all-time old man yells at cloud rant about the brass band craze. All at once, the idea of a brass band shot forth, and from this prolific germ sprang up a multitude of its kind in every part of the land, like the crop of iron men from the infernal seed of the dragon's teeth. Now, something that's important to note about these brass bands is that they didn't actually tend to use trumpets. Instead, many of them favored a very similar instrument called the cornet, which itself had a big role in early jazz. In fact, Louis Armstrong actually started his musical career playing the cornet in brass bands before moving to the trumpet and revolutionizing jazz. And we'll get to that shortly, but first we have one more critical stop en route to the development of jazz: the American Civil War. When the Civil War broke out in 1961, musicians across America were pressed into military service. In addition to entertaining troops, trumpets and drums would serve vital roles on the battlefield, helping to direct troop movements and drive marches. When the dust finally settled in 1865, it left the country with a vast surplus of instruments, and plenty of newly freed Black Americans looking for work. With limited options in a country that was still deeply segregated, many of these people started to work as musicians and entertainers. New Orleans, this manifested as a marching band craze, with musicians taking up the old instruments of war and playing them in new styles that drew influence from Afro-Cuban folk musics. The stars of a lot of these marching bands were cornet players like Buddy Bolden, King Oliver, Bix Beiderbecke, and Louis Armstrong. By the 1920s, jazz was taking hold of the public imagination, and Armstrong was leading the charge as the music's favorite son. He moved from New Orleans to Chicago and then to New York, where he joined up with the orchestra of legendary bandleader Fletcher Henderson. It was with Henderson's orchestra that Armstrong made the switch to trumpet, so he could mesh better with the rest of the band. Before Armstrong, jazz was more oriented toward ensembles, but Armstrong's brilliant improvisations and unmatched talent on the trumpet stole the spotlight. He nearly single-handedly laid the blueprint for jazz as we know it now, with its focus on individual talent and virtuosic solos. He became a star of the early recording industry and was a household name across America by the end of the 20s. Now, Armstrong's change didn't single-handedly convince the cornet players of the world to abandon ship and take up the trumpet. The trumpet held a number of advantages as an instrument, including a brighter sound that carried better in the dance halls where jazz was being played. But basically, every trumpeter since Armstrong owes something to him, and he is one of the main reasons why the trumpet remains synonymous with jazz to this very day. Like the trumpet, the history of drums dates back to the earliest days of humankind, with cultures all around the world independently developing their own drumming traditions. And like the trumpet, the early history of the drums looked a lot different. For most of history, drums and cymbals were played separately by individual percussionists, rather than a single player carrying the entire percussion section on their own. To find the origins of the modern drum kit, we once again need to look to the 19th century and to the American Civil War. The focal points of your modern drum kit are the bass drum and snare, both of which played a key role in military and marching bands. Together, these two instruments can form a simple march beat that drives troops forward, coordinates movement, and keeps morale high. And it's this beat that became the rhythmic foundation for the march music that dominated American popular music in the late 1800s. But not all marching band leaders at this time could afford to roster a large number of musicians. Percussion sections started to shrink, and a number of drummers developed a new technique called double drumming, which allowed them to play the bass and snare at the same time with drumsticks. And the drummers didn't stop there. They began to develop an all-new approach to drums, one that saw all of the complexities of a full percussion section amalgamated into a single individual. In order to achieve this, drummers began to rig all sorts of contraptions together, sticking new cymbals to their sets, as well as things like whistles, woodblocks, and cowbells. Many of these new additions were signs of a fast globalizing world, and the result of a huge wave of immigration in America. Cymbals from China and Persia became commonplace, as did a kind of Asian drum called the tom-tom. These elaborate, diverse proto-drum kits became known as trap sets. Trap sets were particularly popular in vaudeville and musical theater acts, where performers often had limited space for instruments and a desire to wow and entertain with unique and novel sets of sounds. There was only one problem with these trap sets. They were loud. Often, the drums would overpower and drown out the other instruments in the band, especially when it came to recording. So drummers looked for ways to quiet their playing without dampening the spirit of music, and they found a solution in an unlikely place: fly swatters. As this 1913 patent shows us, the tools that we now know as drum brushes were originally designed to kill flies. But as it turns out, these swatters made of fine metal brushes worked perfectly as quieter drumsticks. The early 1900s were full of these sorts of innovations that would eventually become staples in the modern jazz drum kit. They saw the first bass drum pedals hit the market, as well as a small pedal-mounted cymbal called the lowboy, which would eventually develop into the hi-hat. This constant stream of inventions meant that drums were changing constantly through the early days of jazz. It wasn't until the big band era of the 30s and 40s that we started to see trap sets evolve into the modern kit, thanks to legendary drummers like Chick Webb and Gene Krupa. In addition to influencing the sound of the drums, both Webb and Krupa proved that drums could take center stage in a jazz song. Both drummers flavored their music with flashy fills and dramatic solos that proved they were just as talented as any other instrumentalist, if not more. In order to add color to these solos, Trumpet championed a new type of tunable toms that became the basis for most standardized kits today. While drum technologies have continued to change and kits have become more and more elaborate over the years, most drum kits still pretty much resemble what Trumpet played with a few additions. More than just being an essential part of jazz, that kit setup would become standard in soul, rock, metal, and really most popular music in the back half of the 20th century. Unlike the trumpet and the drum, the history of the saxophone does not stretch back for eons. There is absolutely nothing about this instrument that Neolithic humans could have created. And in fact, the saxophone is an instrument so complex, so revolutionary, so powerful, that the gods themselves did all they could to stop it from falling into mortal hands. The saxophone was developed in the 1840s by a man named Adolph Sax. Sax was a brilliant inventor born to a family of instrument designers. He started designing as a teenager and was already making lasting adjustments to existing instruments in his early 20s. But he almost never made it to adulthood. I usually try to avoid quoting Wikipedia verbatim in my videos, but Adolph Sax's page features one of the greatest paragraphs on the whole site, so I'm just gonna read this to you. Sax faced many brushes with death. As a child, he once fell from the height of 3 floors, hit his head on a stone, and was believed dead. At the age of 3, he drank a bowl full of acidic water, mistaking it for milk, and later swallowed a pin. He received serious burns from a gunpowder explosion, and once fell onto a hot cast iron frying pan, burning his side. Several times he avoided accidental poisoning and asphyxiation from sleeping in a room where varnished furniture was drying. Another time, young Sax was struck on the head by a cobblestone and fell into a river, almost dying. His mother once said that he's a child condemned to misfortune. He won't live. His neighbors called him Little Sax, the ghost. Perhaps spurned on by his own seeming invincibility, Sax spent his life designing instruments that look like Seussian fever dreams, and then naming them after himself. He also apparently had some more insane ideas too, including designing a cannon to be used in the Crimean War called the Saxo Cannon, and designing a steam-powered organ called the Saxontere, though neither of these were ever actually made. Over his life, Sax filed 46 different patents for instruments that included sax horns, sax trombas, sax tubas, and his crowning achievement, the saxophone. The saxophone combined the power and volume of brass instruments with the finesse of woodwinds, and it's honestly a really impressive invention. The fingering patterns of saxophones remain consistent across the entire instrument family, which makes it easy for sax players to switch between instruments of different registers. Most of the family members are also light and easily portable, which made them a natural candidate for marching bands. The instrument had some notable fans when it was first invented, but it didn't actually catch on as a solo instrument in early jazz. Some of the most celebrated ragtime orchestras and dance bands used saxophones in the 1910s, but they tended to be part of the ensemble rather than soloists. One exception is Sidney Bechet, an early jazz great who leapt from clarinet to soprano saxophone, becoming jazz's first saxophone star in the process. But when we think of jazz sax, we usually don't picture the soprano. The iconic image of a jazz saxophone tends to be the tenor, and much of that instrument's popularity was thanks to a man named Coleman Hawkins. Hawkins got his start playing with the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra, where he saw the talents of Louis Armstrong firsthand. Armstrong's singular soloing ability no doubt influenced Hawkins, who switched his style after Armstrong joined the orchestra. Originally, Hawkins' playing was more choppy and staccato, but in the mid-20s he developed a smoother, legato sound that let him shine as a soloist, and showed the world the potential of the tenor sax. As Hawkins' star was rising, more tenor players started to grab the spotlight. Lester Young brought a laid-back style to the instrument, shining as one of Billie Holiday's favorite sidemen. And Lester Young's influence actually goes beyond the sax. He's responsible for much of the jazz slang we associate with jazz culture today. He loved wordplay, came up with new turns of phrase all the time, and there's actually a decent chance that it was Young who popularized the word cool as we use it today. Alongside the tenor greats like Hawkins and Young, a number of alto players ensured that the saxophone would always be a part of jazz. The most celebrated among these was Charlie Parker. Parker was one of the most talented musicians in the history of mankind, a visionary player who was the main force in the development of bebop. Bebop served as a perfect showcase for both the alto and tenor saxophones, with its wicked paces, wild runs, and mind-bending song structures. By the time Parker had ascended, it was clear that the tenor and alto saxophones were not just a viable jazz instrument, but could easily become the stars of the show. The sax, drum, and trumpet stand as reminders that the marching band tradition was essential for the development of jazz. But the genre's other star is about as far from a marching band instrument as you can get. The earliest versions of the piano were invented in Renaissance Italy by a man named Bartolomeo Cristofori. They combined the keyboard of earlier instruments like the harpsichord with the tradition of hammered dulcimers, a family of instruments popular in the Middle East that spread through Europe in the medieval era. Piano technologies improved throughout the late Renaissance and soon became the favorite instrument of celebrated composers like Mozart. And it's easy to understand why. The piano is one of the most versatile instruments humankind has ever invented. Its ability to play both melody and rhythm make it a powerful solo instrument and a near unmatched composition tool. It can take the spotlight and carry a song, but it can also mesh into the back and provide a canvas of chords for other instruments to paint on. Because of this, it's been a staple of jazz since the genre's earliest days. Ragtime music, which was jazz's immediate predecessor, made great use of the piano. Its greatest composer, Scott Joplin, became an early pop star selling piano rolls and sheet music. He viewed ragtime as part of a highbrow classical tradition, but jazz's lowbrow precursors made just as much use of the piano. As industrialization made pianos cheaper and easier to manufacture, they became staples in dance halls and in brothels. And it was in the brothels of New Orleans' Storyville district that jazz really started to ferment. There, pianists would play music to keep a lively energy as patrons indulged in all manner of carnal acts. The most famous of these Storyville pianists was Jelly Roll Morton, the first man ever to notate jazz and a key figure in the development of the genre. As jazz spread from New Orleans across America, the piano remained a constant presence. In the ballrooms of 1920s Harlem, acts like James P. Johnson and his student Fats Waller developed a style called stride. Stride piano got its name for the way that players would stride across the piano with their left hand, leaping in between single bass notes and chords in a syncopated pulse. Many of jazz's great early pianists, like Art Tatum and Mary Lou Williams, played stride, and the style would prove to be a huge influence on Duke Ellington. Ellington was one of jazz's true geniuses, and made brilliant use of the piano both as a soloist and as a composer. But honestly, despite the genius of these artists and the greats that followed, the piano's importance in jazz was probably a foregone conclusion just because of the nature of the instrument and the nature of jazz music itself. The upright bass, like the piano, was a product of the Renaissance, first coming about in the 15th century. Historians aren't actually sure which instrument family the bass originally belonged to, with some arguing that it's a violin, while others suggesting it might be adapted from the viol family. And yes, those are two different things, but we're not really going to talk about that now. The bass didn't figure into jazz's marching band roots for obvious reasons. In the early days of jazz, its role was filled by trombones and tubas. But as jazz found its footing, it moved away from bandstands and streets and into clubs, dance halls, and recording studios. Without the need for mobility, musicians started to gravitate toward the double bass. The bass is well suited as a bridge between the rhythm section and the melodists. It provides the root note for the melodies and soloists and serves to lock in the groove. One of the ways that jazz bass accomplished this is with the walking bass line, which is far, far easier to play on an upright than a tuba. These walking lines provide a ton of momentum and color to songs without stealing the spotlight from soloists. Where the tuba requires stops for breath, a bass line can play continually, which gives it a huge edge when it comes to holding the groove together. In addition, the quieter, more nuanced sound of the bass was probably preferable in some of the smaller venues that early jazz bands played in, as tubas can be quite powerful instruments. But the bass's quieter nature was a hindrance too, so jazz bassists invented a new style of playing, which involved players plucking and slapping the strings. This gave the instrument a unique percussive element and became the dominant playing style in jazz bass. On the whole, the bass is just a very versatile instrument that can really tie a whole band together. After all the great stories of the other instruments, I was hoping to pull up some fun or interesting anecdote about the bass's adoption to jazz, but really I think what it comes down to is just the fact that bass rules. While the 5 instruments I've mentioned are the most iconic for jazz, they are, of course, not the only jazz instruments. Trombones have frequently served a role in jazz and still remain part of the iconography to this day. Like the trumpet, they came from a history of symphony orchestras and brass bands. They were everywhere in early jazz and got a chance to truly shine during the big band swing era. But the reason we don't see quite as much trombone iconography is probably because the instrument fell out of favor during the bebop era. There were some that were able to adapt the trombone to bebop's wicked pace, but the nature of the instrument made that adaptation a lot more difficult. And really, in a lot of pop culture, when people imagine jazz, what they're imagining is bebop and post-bop. The guitar is another sort of secondary jazz instrument. These days, plenty of jazz bands have guitarists, and there's a great tradition of jazz guitarists, but the instrument doesn't have quite as strong jazz associations as the trumpet or saxophone. And I think that's because the guitar was a bit of a later addition to the jazz band. In the early days of jazz, the guitar was often too quiet to keep up with the louder brass instruments. There were some acoustic jazz guitarists like Nick Lucas, but the instrument really didn't find a home in jazz until the invention of electric amplification. The electric guitar found a home in big bands as well as smaller outfits throughout the middle century, but its role in jazz was overshadowed by the emergence of rock and roll, which is undeniably an electric guitar-based genre. In the early days of jazz, the role that guitar now plays was frequently filled by the banjo. The banjo was based on traditional West African instruments like the kora. It developed in the Caribbean as part of the Black diaspora and became a natural part of early New Orleans jazz bands, which were combining Caribbean and African influences with European music. In most pictures of early jazz bands, you'll see a banjo. The instrument provided a rhythmic jump for these bands and helped to define the Dixieland sound. But as drum kits developed, they started to edge out some of the space taken up by banjos, and as jazz bands got bigger and drew bigger audiences, the banjo started to get drowned out. While today we don't think of the banjo as a jazz instrument, it kind of spun off and found its own home in bluegrass, which is itself a take on jazz. Along with the banjo, those early pictures of jazz bands often feature clarinets. While there are some famous jazz clarinetists, and the king of swing Benny Goodman was iconic for his clarinet use, the instrument was generally just edged out by the louder saxophone. So there you have it, the story of how jazz came to be played on the instruments that you probably imagine it being played on. There are, of course, plenty of other instruments that you can play jazz on. One of the things that I love about the genre is that it's not bound to any specific instrument. It's a state of mind, a set of cultural and musical practices, and a historical lineage. And that lineage can be adapted to all sorts of different ends. But by looking at the history of why certain instruments have become synonymous with jazz, we can understand that lineage better, and we can have a deeper appreciation for the constant changes that made it such a powerful music. If you enjoyed this little dive into America's cultural history, I think you'll really dig another dive into America's scientific history. 17 Pages is an absolutely stunning documentary detailing one of the greatest scientific scandals in history. It's a beautifully presented deep dive into a controversial science paper, and a work that invites us to interrogate our own biases toward information. It's a really impressive documentary, and one of my favorite things I've watched all year, and you can only watch it on Nebula. Nebula is the prestige streaming service ran by creators for creators, and it's a space that allows us to push our bounds and create incredible projects like 17 Pages, or my friend Maggie Mae Fish's new show, Amy's Dead End Dream House, which explores adult topics through the frameworks of the kinds of children's shows that we all grew up with. Beyond the original content, Nebula is constantly innovating the way that streaming services are run. With Nebula's guest passes, you can invite your friends to watch original content that you loved. Or you can go all the way and buy a loved one a gift card to give them access to Nebula. Then there's the lifetime subscription, a one-time payment that gives you access to Nebula forever and helps fund new original content. If you want to check out any of that, you can head on over to go.nebula.tv/polyphonic to get started now. Signing up with that link will get you 40% off an annual premium subscription, which means just $3 a month or $36 a year. On top of all the great original content, that gets you access to all of my videos a full month early. So you can go right now and watch my next video, in which I analyze Ryan Coogler's Sinners and try to figure out if we should consider it a musical. Following the link in the description is the best possible way to get access to Nebula, and it also just really helps support my channel and allows me to keep making cool videos. So thanks for watching, and thank you all so much for your support.